I'm real pleased to be here with you and being able to share with you a little bit of my work over the last, I think it's dominated my life for nearly 6 years now. What I'm going to do this evening is I'm going to walk you through kind of the first phase of 2 phases of a racial profiling study that I commenced, at least started talking about it back in 2007, 2008. And ultimately got a small grant to carry out the study through the Kansas Transportation Commission, and that was in joint collaboration with the Kansas African American Affairs Commission. And so they commissioned, in essence, the first study, which gave me a little bit of money to travel the state and to talk to citizens who, thought that they had been racially profiled by the police. And then after that study was completed, there was a big void. We thought, well, what do police think about this? If I took the data to them and I said, look, here are the themes that came out of the first study. This is what minority citizens across the state of Kansas, this is how they think they're being racially profiled by police authorities. And so I engaged another just over a year of research, traveled the state, and basically talked to police populations, police officers, and along the way I met a lot of very professional law enforcement folks. Many of their chiefs welcomed me right into their agencies and give me just as much time and access that I needed in order to complete the phase 2 of that study. And of course, phase 2 will come in on April the 4th when I'll present a summary of that study and what that looked like, and then the chief of police will be here to engage in some of that dialogue. So before I get into this, let me just point out 5 real issues as we get into looking at racial profile. And for those of us that study this from an academic perspective, it's a very, very complex social phenomenon to study, to say the least. It is extremely complex. Survey results. First, how many have ever taken a racial profiling survey that you've received in the mail, or you get a call on the phone and they want to talk to you about your experiences, or do you think that racial profiling exists in our society? If you're not, you're in the rarity, because many citizens that I speak to have gotten a call from some surveyor wanting to query them about their thoughts and feelings and attitudes about racial profiling. In other words, do you think it's prevalent in our society, is what they're really getting at. Well, most of the surveys, and there have just been, literally hundreds of surveys over the last 20 years that have been done to where citizens have been called on the phone, or someone will show up at their door and they will ask them about this. Well, not surprising, if you look at racial minority populations and the way they answer, if they in fact believe that racial profiling exists in our society, guess what? Disproportionately they say yes, it exists. It's an everyday part of life for us in our communities. In fact, that data shows anywhere from 60 up to 80% of the surveys in all report that racial minority citizens feel that it is a problem in American society. Yet, breaking that down by race even further, we look at the way Caucasians answer that, and guess what? It's almost an inverse relationship. So we find that anywhere from 20% on up to maybe upper 30% of white or Caucasian Americans think that it is somewhat of a problem. So we have a big racial divide when we survey citizens on their perspective, if they believe that it exists or it doesn't exist. The other issue becomes law enforcement themselves. We know from a lot of research, and much of this research is done from an academic setting, so we know it's designed very rigorous in nature, very robust analytic procedures are used to crunch this data. So we know that minority citizens feel that it's a significant problem. But yet police officers deny they do it, and they basically say, we are just doing our jobs. So keep that in mind as we get into April 4th, and I kind of share with you what the police, how the police respond to these themes that were brought out in this first study. 3 other things that really make this issue somewhat complicated. Academics, those of us who elect to study this for a living, this is a challenge. A significant challenge for us. We are still trying to figure out the best way to actually capture the data, to collect the data, and to analyze the data. Some researchers are into going out and collecting traffic stop data that's furnished by a police department, and we get that data, and there's really not a whole lot you can do with it. So what we end up doing is we end up forming some benchmark for that. So we use census benchmarks or population benchmarks to compare back to the community and those that have been stopped, and then we make guesstimates. We do some pretty, I guess, descriptive statistics and some other rather more robust statistics to let us know if there are differences, though, or if African Americans or Hispanics are more at risk of being stopped based on 2,000 citations that we're able to get records from the local police department. So that's one way. There are many other ways. Some researchers go out and they do traffic surveys, etc. So the big issue here is, how do you establish an effective benchmark once you get that data to compare that back to that benchmark? That has been controversial among researchers, and that work continues today to come up with the best benchmark to give us the best estimates. Historical relationships between racial minority communities and the police in this country have been strained for a long, long time. This factors into this very much so. I'm often amazed when I work with, I wouldn't say totally police groups, but also student groups on campus. And I'll engage them in a dialogue on racial profiling, and they seem to want to just kind of blur out or jump over the historical context of race in this country. And I don't think you can effectively do that and really address the issue of racial profiling. I think that factors in because there is a long, long history there. I'll talk about that a little bit more on April the 4th when I present to you the police results. And lastly, legislative mandates. It's still evolving. Most states now, they have legislation or statutes that require police or authorities across the state to collect racial profiling data and to report that into some governing body within the state, and then they get and do some analysis with that. The problem with that is many states, they don't have any teeth in that legislation. So in other words, several states, law enforcement authorities just weren't reporting the data in. So that become problematic as well. So, legislation needs to really be perfected in order to get this down. And, I submit, and I tell you, most of the chiefs and the chief executives of law enforcement organizations that I have had the privilege to travel around and talk with around this state, they are all for collecting data. I plug Wichita, Kansas right now because with Chief Gordon Ramsey, he has brought just a breath of fresh air into the Wichita Police Department. I've had an opportunity to talk with Chief Ramsey on several occasions about data collection and how we do that effectively, etc. He is very much into that. He is very much into opening the door and being more transparent in the way his department operates. But in essence, I just wanted to give you just a taste of the complex nature of how difficult it is to study this issue, and it really is. So, again, this study was broken down into really two phases. The first phase, I was approached by the Kansas Transportation Commission, along with at the time, the executive director of the Kansas African American Affairs Commission, and they were looking for someone to do a qualitative study, meaning that we're going to get away from the statistics for a change, and we want someone that can go into the field and talk to citizens who claim they've been racially profiled by the police and put that data together in some, robust qualitative procedure, and we use a lot of those, and and then report back what that really looks like. So they asked me if I was interested in taking it on, and I said, sure, what an opportunity. So the first phase of that study probably lasted just over 2 years. There was an initial 6 months of getting things set up, and then the travel started. So I spent a lot of weekends in places across Kansas, and to be honest with you, I didn't even know a lot of these communities existed. I had a wonderful experience out in western Kansas. I spent some weekends out there in the Dodge City area, Cimarron. There's a little community off of Dodge City called Spearville, Kansas, which I hadn't heard of before. Ended up interviewing a couple of persons there in that area. And then into eastern Kansas, some very wonderful locations there, Topeka, Kansas City, And of course the Wichita Metroplex, I had more than enough work to do here, and then throughout central Kansas as well. So in all, there were about 16 Kansas communities from eastern Kansas all the way to western Kansas that I visited and spent some time talking with citizens who believed that they had been racially profiled by police authorities. And then of course phase 2 went into the law enforcement data when we shared this information with law enforcement in focus groups and individual interviews to see what their perspectives were on this. And again, that will be reported on the 4th. So the number one objective, of course, of this first study, what I'm going to take you through this evening, we were interested in how minority citizens across the state of Kansas, how they experience what they believe to be racial profiling, and secondly, how they gave meaning to those experiences. So what did they think about that experience? What did it mean for them as a racial minority or an ethnic minority citizen living in Kansas? So again, just to give you some idea here, I covered the western part of the state probably. In the end, I actually interviewed well over 100 citizens. I elected to only use 67 of their citizens in the final data set. The reason for that is they had the most compelling and the richest stories and narratives to tell, and so I used 67 in the end. But again, I was all over the state, so whether it was western Kansas, eastern Kansas, I tried to get persons who lived in those areas and experienced those, because one of my objectives as well with the procedure that I used was to find out if those experiences were similar, whether you were in western Kansas or Wichita or Kansas City, Olathe, or even Topeka for that matter. So I wanted to see if those experiences held true regardless of geographical area. So a little bit of snapshot on who I talk with. Again, there were well over 100. And I tell you, when I got into this work, I really befriended a lot of people. A lot of people would call me, they would want to talk to me about the study, and that, believe it or not, has continued to date. I will hear from participants of this study just following up, wanting to see where my work was now and what the next stage is, etc. So it's been very rewarding in the respect that I have met a lot of people who are really genuinely interested in seeing things get better, seeing the relationship between communities of color and law enforcement get better. So, over 100 were interviewed. Now I would get calls, I'll tell you this, I would be in my office and I did a lot of advertising in order to get participants and to begin snowballing participants so I can get out in the field. And me as a white male researcher, largely wanting to research African Americans and Hispanic citizens who said they have been racially profiled, there was somewhat, I think, early on suspicions of my real motivations. So oftentimes it took several contacts before I could actually get an interview set up and get into the field and meet that individual in an agreed upon area. And oftentimes it might be a coffee shop, or if it was the case of Dodge City, Kansas, I had a great gatekeeper there. She told me, you come on out, we'll get them set up, we'll get the interview set up for you. And so I went out one weekend and they told me that to come over to a certain address. And where was it at? It was at the Dodge City Country Club. So they took me back and it was overlooked this beautiful, I think it was either the first tee-off hole there at the Dodge City Country Club, beautiful window. And they had me interviews scheduled for an hour each. And so they would bring in another participant. They fed us, and it was a great environment. So rewarding experience with some of these research venues that I actually had an opportunity to visit. So there were 91. In the end, I used 87 citizen stories. These 87 citizens, there were 91 stories that were used. So some of these citizens had multiple stories, obviously, to tell. A little bit about their ages, the average age of 38. So these weren't just all, 18 and 19-year-old young persons who, are out there saying, the police did this to me. Many of these folks, they were professionals in their fields, and as you can see, the range, the youngest was 18, and the oldest person that I interviewed was 68 years old. And breaking that down by race, so you kind of have some feel as I get going through this presentation, who was involved in this. 53 of my participants were African Americans, and you can look at the gender breakdown as well. I had 33 Hispanics that I used in the study, and 1 Asian. And the Asian population was a group that was very difficult for me to recruit participants. I just didn't have much luck there. I did develop a gatekeeper, and a gatekeeper in my work is someone that we use to help us, to get us introduced to people who may have knowledge of the phenomenon that we happen to be studying. So I had a gatekeeper, but it just did not pan out with Asian Americans. So I had 1. And I elected in the end, I was going to just take that out, but I thought, you know, this is a good story. I think I'm going to leave it in and see where this fleshes out with the other stories, to see if these experiences, the contextual experiences, are somewhat the same. Just another small tidbit on one of my Hispanic gatekeepers that got me into this. This was a Wichita location. And this person calls me up and said, hey, look, I know the owner of this great Mexican restaurant off of 21st Street North and just east of Amadon. And he said, you know, you're more than welcome to come and hold your focus groups in his restaurant in the back room. So I took him right up on it, and guess what? We got again, some very good food. So it was a nice environment. Okay, so what happens in this type of research, in this type of qualitative study? What I do is I go out and I interview people. Many times these are multiple interviews over the course of time. So I may have 1 participant, but I might end up interviewing that participant 2, 3, or 4, or 5 times, depending on the point to where I reach what I consider saturation of the data. In other words, this participant's not giving me any new information. So at that point, you know, there's no use really going on. So some of these were 1 or 2 interviews, while others were half a dozen interviews with a participant. Oftentimes that was simply because they were holding back, and I knew that, and it took me several interviews to really break the ice, so they could trust me a little bit more and be able to sit down and then let the raw emotions go about their experience. And that happened on more times than one. I had participants that were sobbing by the time the interview was over, and I knew at that point that there's a saying in criminological research that we do that, you can stage where you can reach, the basics, what happened, this and that, but there's also the backstage, and that's where you begin to sense those raw emotions that come out within the interview setting itself. And that, of course, is where we want to be when we do this type of work, is we want to be with those raw emotions, because that's when we're going to get the richest information. Okay, so 6 themes. The first one is a theme that I actually named this one emotional affective theme, okay? Now let me tell you a little bit about how these themes were actually named or labeled. Oftentimes I would take something in vivo that I would see from a participant. They would say something, or I'd read something in a transcript, and I said, wow, that's it. I'm going to actually use what they said to name this theme. Okay, so in most cases, the participants themselves would use this vocabulary within the context of the interview, and I would see it and I would say, that sounds like a great name for this theme. So I ended up naming a theme. So this was one that actually I had to come up with because I was challenged. This took me a while to really get the name of this down, but in essence, what this really involves, participants, they talked a lot about the embarrassment of being stopped. The embarrassment of being stopped and being taken out of your car and made to stand beside your car when people that they knew were driving by and looking at them. This came through in almost every interview, this idea of this emotional affective and how that impacted these participants. There was also a heightened sense of knowing that the police were there. Now we think, gosh, don't we all get nervous when we're driving along and we see a police officer or a police officer's following us? I can tell you, as a Caucasian, it doesn't bother me that much. I just don't really think about it that much. But I can tell you what, there is something very real with many of the minority citizens that I talk to. There is something very real there, something very real, and I wanted to capture that as much as I could. Some of this goes back to when they told me they grew up. They grew up in homes to where their parents or their grandparents or their uncle and aunt would set them down and talk with them about what they would do and how they should act when they confronted a police officer. And I start I actually got a book deal out of this and published it just a couple of years ago, and I'll share that with you at the end if you're interested in picking that up. But I start my book out with a story of a young African-American guy in Atlanta, Georgia, who leaves his house and he's driving to get to the airport. He's got a couple of other people that are following him, and he gets to an intersection and he's in the right-hand lane and he wants to make a left-hand turn, so he turns from the right-hand lane to make his turn. Well, in Georgia, that's a violation because you should be in the left-hand lane to make your left-hand turn. So he gets stopped by the Atlanta Police Department, who were sitting across the street, and he saw him do the traffic violation. So they come up, there were two officers. He didn't know one was on the other side of his SUV. One comes up on the driver's side and he starts knocking on the window like that, and it startled him. Rolls down his window and the officer begins to badger him. What are you doing? You know, what? Are you driving erratic? Why are you driving so erratic? Et cetera, et cetera. And so this young African-American male says, well, I'm doing that because I thought someone was following me. And then the police seemed to escalate their badgering of this particular person who was getting stopped. And they said, well, why would someone be following you? What's wrong with you? You know, are you crazy? And then at that time, the officer on the other side of the car begins to bang on the window and says, roll down the window, you know. And so he says, give me the key. Well, his key was on kind of it was a long, almost like a real short baton style. You've seen these, a lot of people have these, and it has a short chain on it. So he went to reach for the key, and he noticed the officers tensed up and they stepped back, and one of them even reached and put his hand close to his weapon. This individual said, that's when I stopped. And I remember something that my mother told me 20 years ago as a kid growing up. See, his mother grew up in the deep South, the deep segregated South, and she saw a lot of injustice in her life. She saw a lot of men that she knew go off with the police and come back either brutalized, beat up, or they didn't come back at all, according to his mother. So he remembers this. He freezes and he says, look, you know, can I get out of the car? Because he's thinking, this is becoming a safety concern now. I need to get out of this car. And so they let him get out of the car, and when he gets out of the car, he notices another police unit begin to pull up, and he looks back, and it's an African-American officer in the car. So the two white officers, the African-American officer gets out of the car, and according to this young black male, he has the look of old shit on his face. And so these two white officers go back, and about a minute later they come up and they apologize to the driver and say, you know, look, you committed a traffic violation. We are going to write you a ticket for that. You know, we're sorry if we scared you or something like that. And this particular driver happened to be a guy by the name of Tyler Perry, if you've heard of him. Multiple millionaire 2 times over. I start my book out with his story because I think it's a very compelling story. That here is a guy, and I wanted to make the case of how he remembered back 20 years ago, his mother telling him that if he's stopped by the police, this is what you do and this is what you don't do. Very, very real. And I submit to you that oftentimes in the white community, we don't think about that. We don't talk about that, and probably most of us didn't have our mothers and fathers telling us what to do when we got stopped by the police. But I can tell you, it's a very different situation. We're dealing with many minority families in this country. So there's this idea of the emotional affective realm here. The anticipation of being stopped was always there. The increased anxiety, anger. You know, as I begin to get through this study, and at the end, you know, you're always trying to apply some theoretical explanations to what you're finding in the data. And, you know, one of the things that was really interesting to me is that some of these symptoms that some of the participants were telling me, I went to look to see if these were closely related to PTSD. And, you know, some in the room may have suffered from PTSD, not necessarily from military service or some other public safety service, but other walks in your life when you've had traumatic incidents. And I found that many of these, in my mind, these match up clearly with, you know, the diagnosis that you go through to make a PTSD, that this stress, this anxiety, you know, continues on. In some cases, I had one individual, it's been years, and he still is extremely bothered by this. I'm going to, as I go through the rest of the themes, I'm going to always kind of try to blend in a rich quote that I've taken just to kind of illustrate this theme. This is one here. This was a young African American, I believe this was a male, and I saw him, the police officer, sitting in the parking lot. And he stared at me as I drove by. I knew there was a good chance he would start following me. I was about maybe a block away, and I saw him pull out and come in my direction. He followed me for about 2 more blocks, and I remember thinking, okay, he is going to stop me any minute. That's just a fact when you are black and driving late at night. Now that was compelling. That resonated with me significantly when I had a young man saying that. That's just a fact. And he said it as a matter of fact. You know, that's it. That's my life. That's the life of many African Americans, you know, in our communities, that we go out, we always think about that. And then we couple that with some other things that I'm going to talk about in just a moment when I get to what I call the symbolic vehicle, or the symbolic minority vehicle. A couple of other quotes here. For many of us, especially African American males, we laugh and joke about it, but it's a serious matter. Whenever I drive past the police, I find myself getting nervous, even though I've done nothing wrong. I was embarrassed that someone who knows me would drive by and see, you know, there must have been 4 or 5 police cars, you know that you haven't done anything, and it hurts so badly, and you can't do anything about it. You learn to expect this. So that's another, I mean, I put this in red because that resonated with me. You learn to expect that. Now, you know, come on, we're in 2017. We have fellow citizens telling us that we learn to expect this in our lives. Young African American men, you learn to expect this. You know, something is seriously wrong if young African American men, if young Hispanic men, young African American females, and Hispanic females, if they're thinking this, something is seriously wrong, and we have to address that. The second theme that was really strong in this study was what I labeled the symbolic vehicle. Actually, some of my participants thought that I should have labeled this the symbolic hoopty. Okay, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about the hoopty in just a moment. It was very real, and it was talked a lot about in interviews and focus groups. And so there is a belief on the part of these participants that I was with a long time, it seemed like a long time, that the police tend to stereotype the types of vehicles that they drive, and they associate certain vehicles to what is considered a minority vehicle. So I wanted to explore that a little bit more. So, you know, tell me more about this minority vehicle. And they said, you know, haven't you heard of a hoopty? You know what a hoopty is? And I said, educate this white boy. Well, I knew what a hoopty was, but I wanted them to tell me a little bit more about it. So they tell me that what they do sometimes is they'll purchase a vehicle, you know, that needs a lot of work. It's a junk vehicle, and I'll show you a picture of one here in just a moment. And they'll fix it up, and they'll slap on some customized paint. When they get the money saved up, they'll put rims on it and make it look really good. Oftentimes they'll tint the windows. You know, they paint these in some cases, very earthly, earth tone colors. And that's what they consider a hoopty. And so they drive these around because they put a lot of work into them. Well, they say that the police associate that type of vehicle with minority drivers. And they say driving that and being a minority driving that is going to alert the police on you. Said, so you tell me, really? That's going to alert the police on you? Say, yes. And so I had participants tell me that, you know, they had thought about getting rid of their customized cars and not driving them anymore because they literally were getting stopped so much in them. So, you know, then I started asking, well, you know, you were getting stopped in these cars. You know, did you get tickets? Why were you getting stopped? And that got into another area in and of itself. The stops were primarily for what they called miscellaneous things, such as a cracked windshield, you know, a cracked tail light. A couple of participants told me that they were stopped for not using their turn signal 100 feet from an intersection. Now, I tell you, I probably violate that one a couple of times a day. I just don't use my turn signal 100 feet from the intersection. So in just a moment, I'm going to group that into another theme that came out of this study. So here's a couple of quotes that came from that theme. You can just read these. They stopped me because I was black and driving a nice car. They probably think I'm not supposed to drive a nice car. If I was driving my Kia, I would have never been stopped. So this was another thing. This theme was almost split, kind of a binary theme, because of the fact that, participants told me if they're driving around in what they considered the hoopty, that's going to alert the police. But yet, on the other hand, I had this other real strong theme that came through here, that if I'm driving an expensive vehicle, that's going to alert, because the police are going to say, what are you doing in that expensive vehicle? So let me just give you one quick story, and this is one that I haven't forgot this story. Young African-American male, I believe he was about 26 years old, had a Cadillac SUV, pristine condition, took care of it, a couple of years old when his incident happened. He's driving along and he gets stopped. And officer comes up to the Cadillac, and the driver was getting his driver's license ready, and the officer comes up and says, first thing out of his mouth, according to the participant, is, whose car is this? And he said, well, it's mine. He said, are you sure it's yours? And he said, yes. He didn't ask for his driver's license. He said he asked for his insurance, his proof of insurance, because he wanted to check the insurance to see if the insurance matched the vehicle that he was driving. So he thought that was a little bit unusual. And he says, on the scene, while this officer was still there, I began to think about, you're stopping me because I'm driving this nice Cadillac, and you don't think a 26-year-old African-American male should be driving this nice Cadillac. So this gets better. So he does get his driver's license then, but he says he never really looked at his driver's license, and began to talk to the passenger, or the driver of the car. And he asked him, he said, so this is yours, so how do you afford a vehicle like this when I can't even afford a vehicle like this? So he remembers thinking, oh man, I know this, these are code words here, that I'm not supposed to be driving this. So interestingly enough, when I got through with the first phase, and this has been about 2 years ago, I was in Topeka and I was presenting these results to a number of law enforcement executives. They were chiefs from various departments across the state. And there were some representatives from the Kansas African American Affairs Commission there. I remember walking them through this story of this young man. I remember several of the chiefs just sitting there and shaking their heads and basically, saying that, if an officer is saying something like that, he is just, he's a loser. We need to deal with that. And so, they were saddened that an officer would say something like that. So you think sometimes that words don't matter, sometimes words do matter. And I'll give you another great story here in just a moment. The symbolic hoopty, here's what it looks like. You buy these things, you can get them pretty cheap, and you fix them up. I was advised pretty early on that you pronounce it hoop-D, and you just put the D on the end. So I stopped trying to put the TIE on the end. It's just much easier to go with the hoop-D. So that's what it oftentimes will look like when it's purchased, and they'll take time, and if they build up money, they'll begin to put custom paint on it, rims, and before long it really looks nice. And here's another example, the hoopty. And this is a quote here I took from an African-American gentleman, and this guy must have been about 29 at the time I was interviewing him. He had been stopped a lot in what he considered, or what he called, his hoopty. And so, I pulled one of the quotes from his transcript, and he basically says, I've thought about getting rid of it, buying a plain-looking car like a Ford Focus or something. It's a damn shame I have to worry about this every time I pull out of my driveway in my ride. A little bit of backstory here. This guy was, he worked, had no run-ins, no record with the police whatsoever. I think at the time he was 29 years old. Really a really nice guy. I enjoyed, talking with this guy, and he just liked piddling around with cars. And he'd buy these old cars and he'd fix them up, and he'd take them out on the weekends. And he said, depending on where I would drive this car, I guarantee I'm going to get stopped. So again, it goes back to, he was always alerted when he saw a police car. He was always alerted to the possibility that the police car would do the U-turn and begin to follow him. And he said 9 times out of 10, boom, there would be a stop. 90% chance he would not even get issued a ticket. So he tells me, here I am, I'm getting stopped for some BS not using my turn signal. I'm 100 feet from an intersection. And he asks me questions and takes my driver's license, runs me, and then he comes back and tells me I'm free to go. And then he takes off. No explanation whatsoever. So I'm sitting there, so what am I supposed to think? You know, I just got racially profiled. That's what this young man told me. Another theme that came out of this study was what I named the nature of the violation, because I heard this so often. It was participants would tell me, you know, I'm being stopped for just piddly, miscellaneous, BS types of violations. And they'd often come back and tell me, you know, you go look over in this affluent area or in this white community, and I guarantee you they're not getting stopped for not using their turn signal 100 feet from the intersection, or for a cracked tail light or a cracked windshield and things of that nature. He says, I'll just bet you not. So go look. And they kept challenging me to do that. And one of these days, that will be the next study, as we begin crunching that data on tickets, who's getting tickets and who's not. So what I found here in this self-report data from these 92 reported violations, 32% of those were for what we call equipment types of violations. So in other words, tinted windows falls in that category, defective brake lights, cracked tail lights, literally. There were several that they would tell me, come out and look at my brake light and I'll show you. And they would be cracked, I mean just cracks, maybe like that. In some cases 6 inches, 7, 8 inches, something like that, you know. In some cases the brake light still emitted, you could see it, but it was just cracked, and so they would get stopped for that. Oftentimes no tickets, they were just stopped, told about it, not even a warning or anything, and then they were checked out and told they could be on their way. So again, this resonates to the drivers that, you know, what is this? You know, I'm getting stopped for these, you know, BS things, and they're taking my driver's license, and they knew what they were doing. They were running them to make sure they didn't have warrants out on them, et cetera, et cetera. And, you know, then they would let go. They would let go with not even a warning or a ticket. And, you know, you think, well, you know, most folks, if you got stopped by the police and you didn't get a ticket, wow, man, that's something great, man. Got away without getting a ticket. It was something different here. They really interpreted this much, much different, that the officer's going to take the time to do this, and I don't even get a ticket or a warning ticket out of it. You know, this has got to be related to my race and me driving this symbolic hoopty. No, let me just back up here. I have this here, the pretext stops. Anyone ever heard the pretext stop before? Okay, I do a course here on campus, a college class. It's called Racial Profiling. In that class, we break this down to the actual Supreme Court decision, and we look at the nature of the United States, or the Wren versus United States Supreme Court decision, which basically doesn't really tell the police that you're authorized to do pretext. It just really confirms what the police had been doing for many, many years. So in essence, what the pretext stop is, it's an invaluable police tool, to be honest with you. There is some concern now that that police tool is being abused by being woven into an everyday practice of patrol procedures. So in other words, here's how a pretext stop would go. Let's say that an officer gets some complaints from neighbors living in a 2 or 3 block area, and they're concerned about what they report as being, let's say, a drug house. They say there's cars in and out of there at all hours of the night, and these neighbors think they're selling drugs and they don't want it in their community. So they want the police to do something. So the officer that's working that area goes over and begins to set off the house, and sure enough, he sees cars coming and going at certain times. And so he decides to stop one of the cars that happens to be leaving this house that's been reported as a drug house by the community members. So he follows the car a little ways, and lo and behold, no turn signal. The car does not use the turn signal. So he stops the car. Now, that's not the real purpose of the stop, right? The turn signal. The officer probably could care less about the turn signal. The real purpose of the stop with that officer is to investigate to see who just left that house, who it is, and to see if maybe this person would start talking a little bit about what's going on in this house. So that's what is considered a pretext stop. And the Supreme Court has said that, you know, the police have been doing this a long, long time. And, you know, the nature of the pretext, it is an important police tool. And so in 1996, the Supreme Court, in the Wren decision, basically upheld the police use of those pretextual stops, okay? But now the concern is, if the police are using those pretext stop as an everyday standard operating procedure, stopping every car they can based on a pretext. And if in fact they're doing that, that is problematic. One of the recommendations that came out of this work to law enforcement was the fact that maybe we need to look at some additional documentation when an officer initiates a pretextual stop, so that we can have some mechanism to be transparent that that stop wasn't based on race, that it was a race-neutral stop. And so that was presented. Many chiefs actually like that idea. Of course, the concern is, what would that look like? How would that work? And ideally, it's something that you wouldn't want an officer in the field spending an extra 5 or 10 minutes on filling out another piece of paperwork that they probably don't need to do. So the idea was to have something developed that can be checked off or even entered into the computer by checking the boxes that would take 30 seconds or 45 seconds to complete when that officer uses a pretextual stop. And it just goes, again, to put some checks and balances on those stops to give the police agencies a little better idea of how their officers are actually using the pretextual stop. But that Wren decision with the pretext has made it, again, very complicated for us to look at this racial profiling, and to make a case that racial profiling occurred, because in reality, if you have a dishonest police officer, and I'm not saying that all police officers are dishonest, because I don't believe they are, but we do have some that are dishonest, and we've known that through cases that we looked through the years. But they could potentially abuse this and hide behind the cloak of the Wren decision when they're making these automobile stops of minorities in our communities. So again, there's a lot of different techniques and models that agencies can use now. One of those is what we call internal audits, to where line level supervisors are more involved with making audits of their patrol officers. In other words, the patrol officer is required to set back and maybe if it's every month or every 2 months, and take a look and ask him or herself, who am I stopping? What types of cars do I stop more? What types of violations? Basically self-auditing themselves and then asking themselves, if I'm working in a 90% minority community or a 90% African American community, what would this look like? Could this be perceived as being a racially profiling or racial profiling? So, there's a lot of neat stuff that's beginning to evolve on how we can begin to track what officers are doing in the field and their behavior a little bit more. And the good thing about this is that chiefs and police officers, now that we have more, I think, innovative minded police chiefs taking those positions, like in Wichita, I think they're going to be more receptive to some of these ideas. Okay, theme 3 was the nature of the violation. Again, this is a quote. You can read through this. I've got the book. I've just, got the book full of some of the best quotes that I could get out of the interviews, and I just piled the book full of those. So it gives the reader really a flavor and a taste of what, minority citizens go through at the hands when they're stopped by the police, and particularly that they perceive their stops to be racially motivated. And this is another thing that resonated with me here in the red. The older I get, the more I just learned that it's easier just to let them do their thing so I can get on my way. This come up several times in the interviews, to where participants would tell me that the police asked if they could search my car. Okay, and we know police can do that. Anyone can get stopped and ask if an officer can search the car. I mean, they can just ask. It's a consent search. And if evidence is collected out of the car, it's admissible because you gave consent. You don't have to give consent to search unless the officer, if the officer has probable cause, he's not going to ask you for consent to search. They're just going to search your car. But any officer can stop you and ask to search your car, and if you give the officer consent, they can search. It's that easy. So oftentimes citizens don't know that, and of course then I tell them, well, be a good citizen, study up on what you can and can't do. And then, of course, I give them a flyer to the criminal justice program and say, why don't you come out and major in criminal justice? And in your criminal procedure and law classes, you will learn that. You will learn those amendments. So I always get my recruiting spiel on. Yes, ma'am.
So what happens
if you say no? If you say no, typically if the officer doesn't have probable cause, he's going to let you go. Now, what some of the participants would come back And they would say, you know, that I let them search just to get it over with, because if I don't, you know, if I say no, they're going to make it harder on me. They may detain me longer, and, you know, I'm trying to get somewhere, you know, I'm trying to get to work or, you know, somewhere else, etc. So they just do it almost as this is just a routine thing. I just let them do their thing. I had participants literally use that language, quote unquote. I just let them do their thing so I can get on my way. So a lesser theme that really came out of this in the end was this idea of the coercive nature of the police when they're asking to search. Some participants said, well, you know, I can just, you know, call for a drug dog to come out here and go around the car right quick and things of that nature. And they felt that was more of a coercion to get them to give in to let them search vehicles. And oftentimes they would let them search. They would just go ahead and let them search as opposed to go through with that. Okay, theme 4 was officer demeanor. Many participants felt like, you know, the officers, their communication style wasn't the best with them, that they talked down to them. I heard this term a lot, you know, I hadn't done anything, but they treated me like a criminal, you know, it was more accusatory in nature. And the big thing that really stood out in this theme was the ambiguity when they were stopped, okay? So what this really centered on, they would get stopped, the officer would make contact with the driver would ask the officer, well, what did I get stopped for? And it would be, well, let me see your driver's license and your registration, or your driver's license and proof of insurance. Okay, what officer, what am I being stopped for? I'll be back with you in a moment. So the officer never up front let the citizen know why they were being stopped. So they said the officer beat around the bush about it. So then they would go back and they would come back up to the car and initiate, you know, contact with the driver again, give the driver's license back and say, well, you know, you're free to go. And again, well, officer, what did you stop me for? Well, you know, we're getting reports of a drug house over here you were seen leaving the area, so I stopped you just to check you out. So oftentimes that's the way these stops went down. So the ambiguity up front of the stop, and one of the things that we know is that you can resolve a potential situation with a driver. We know if you look at the policing literature on effective contacts, we know there's a couple of things about what makes an effective police contact. That's when the police officer right away upon contact gives the violator their name, you know, right there. My name is Officer so-and-so. You know, I'm with the Wichita Police Department. I'm stopping you today because of this, this, or this. That's the best way. You can eliminate some of that ambiguity. You know, interestingly enough, when I was traveling the state, many departments that I came across didn't have what I call the script in their policy or their protocol manuals, okay? I can tell you Wichita has it, Sedgwick County Sheriff has a script in there, so officers, you know, when they stop someone, you know, there are certain things they do, and one of those up front is why you're being stopped. Many departments across the state didn't have that, and so if you don't have it, you can't expect the officer to follow that. At this point, many departments have begun to put that in their standard operating procedure. You know, this protocol, when you stop a vehicle, you give the driver your name, you know, your badge number, or whatever the case may be, and why they're being stopped. And here's just a quote from this theme. You can read through this. You know, the idea of acting superior, talking down to me, his voice, his words, the way he talked. He treated me like I was inferior. Here, I think a lot of black men get offended because the police, make them feel like less than a man, especially in front of other people. So I heard that quite a bit as well. You know, we know that, you know, effective communication skills in policing can either de-escalate something 99% of the time. If you're an effective communicator, you're going to be able to de-escalate a lot of situations. But, you know, I can tell you, when you look, there are some that can't use those effective communication skills, and they come in to a relatively quiet situation that somebody has begun to diffuse, and they come in and just with their attitude and the way they talk to a person, this thing gets blown up again, and then you have a real situation on your hands. So communication is so important. I often like to think, when you look at police training models, about 90% of what we train our young recruits in the academy for is what they're going to be doing anywhere from 20 to 30% in the field. That's the law enforcement activities, the running from call to call, the armed robbery to armed robbery. Most police activities reveal that's only anywhere from 20 to 30%. So what do they do the other time? And don't say donut shop, we have an officer in here. Service-related problem-solving functions, okay? A lot of that. That's the majority of the police job. Solving problems, service-related, which, basically, you need some training to that, and that requires communication, that requires problem-solving skills that you need to learn in the academy and then have that tested in service throughout. Officers qualify with their firearms, in some cases 4 times a year. How often do they go back to the academy to qualify with their verbal judo or their communication skills? I submit probably not that much. So maybe sometimes we can look at police training curriculum to ensure that we are in fact training officers for a new, if we want to meet the goals of the 21st Century Task Force on the Police, which came out just a couple of years ago, one of the things that they address in there, training models, and ensuring those training models are equipped with communication and community-oriented policing that just doesn't happen with a few officers sprinkled around the department, but is a total holistic operational approach for the agency. Okay, theme 5 of the 6 here, normative experience. This was big. Just a fact of life. This is normal, a normal day for life as me, as a minority, as a Hispanic, as an African American in this community. This happens to us in our communities. It becomes an accustomation, almost norm. They literally use the term norm in many of the interviews. This is norm, this is the norm, in a matter-of-fact way. A couple of quotes here I think that illustrates this fairly well. I have become so used to the possibility of being stopped, it's like everyday thing. When I see a police officer, I automatically begin to think that I may be stopped. It is always there in the back of your mind. It's automatic. You just think about it when you see a police car. And, too many black males in a car will strike up suspicion. That's the norm. There's that word norm used verbatim in a quote. My friends refuse to let other black people pile up in the car or they'll get stopped. That's just the norm. It's not just worth the hassle. Why take the chance and give them a reason? And see kind of the idea here of giving them a reason. So it's almost, we go back to the us against them mentality or attitude. A couple of others, I've really gotten used to being stopped. It's just part of life for a black man. Think about that. Getting used to being stopped. Part of life for a black man. This came from an individual that I interviewed around Olathe, Overland Park area, and it had a compelling story to tell. Getting stopped by the police is a reality in our neighborhood. White communities don't understand because they don't face it like we do. It's a matter of fact to us, and I think oftentimes that's what we forget. We interpret it from our own lens. Whether you're white, we interpret it that way. We don't think about it. We don't think about the real everyday lived experiences from people in communities of color that say that this happens and this is important to them. And you can't take experience away. That experience oftentimes lasts for a long, long time when you've experienced something. Think about that in your own personal lives. And the last theme here that came out of this study was the idea of race and place. What's that really mean? It means that African Americans said, it's damned if I do, damned if I don't. I get stopped when I'm in communities that they say may have more crime in those communities. And oftentimes they would tell me, I live close to those areas that have a disproportionate amount of crime in those areas. So if I'm going there and I'm at a certain time I'm driving through, particularly if I'm in my hoopty, there's a higher level that I'm going to get stopped. And they told me it happens. It happens all the time. But yet again, I had them tell me that if there are affluent white areas and they happen to be driving in, that's going to alert them to the police as well. And I have a wonderful story I share in the book about a guy, a painter, 52 years old, African-American gentleman, tells me this wonderful story about, he's been painting for 20 some odd years. He's got a job in a real affluent area of this community. And he goes to lunch, driving his old truck, comes back from lunch, and as he pulls into this area, he notices a police car pass him. And the police officer in the car looks at him and, stares at him. And so, right away, he said, I just wondered if, he was going to turn around and stop me or check me out further. And he said, sure enough, half a block away, I look in my rearview mirror and he does a U-turn. So, he follows him. He's back there about a block, but I can tell he's there. He's surveilling me. He said there's no doubt he was surveilling me. So I pull up into this house that I'm painting, and he drives by, and he slows up, and he gets a real good look at me, and then he looks at the house, and he must have figured at that point, well, this guy's here painting this house, so he must be okay. And he drives off. So this, I think, is a good example of what many of my participants told me when they were in predominantly white affluent areas, to where they would get signaled out more so. And then not only that, when they're in other communities that have high levels of crime, they would be singled out for that and be stopped. If they were in their hoopty, they would be stopped, and then oftentimes they said it would go to, do you know this person, do you know that person, what are you doing in this area, et cetera, et cetera. And here's just a quote that kind of illustrates that. This was a young lady about, she was in her mid-20s when I interviewed her. She was going over to a friend's house who lives in a white area, and this is an African-American lady, and she said that she saw the police officer pass, and sure enough, same situation, began to follow her, stops her ultimately. She began to think, am I going to get stopped? Gets stopped, and the violation was for a cracked windshield. And she said, I really don't know how I was able to see I had a cracked windshield, because it wasn't a very, large crack at all. But incidentally, she got stopped and basically checked out, and then did get a warning for the cracked windshield and was sent on her way. She interpreted that it was because I'm a black female driving this yellow vehicle, which stands out in a predominantly white area. Okay. So that phase one, that was my work in phase one in a nutshell, and I've just given you what I give my students in about 16 weeks out here for a class. So what I'll do on the fourth is I'm going to run you through, once I started working with the police and getting their perspective on this, I lay these themes out and had some wonderful dialogue with law enforcement from this area and from around the state. And I teased out a number of different things. So if you can make it on the 4th, I believe that Chief Ramsey is scheduled to be here as well. So when I present, we'll kind of have some dialogue after that, and I think it will be a real productive session. So if you can make the 4th, I would encourage you to try to come back. And also, if you are interested, and I'm not here trying to market my book or anything, but if you're interested in it and you want to learn more about it, because this does focus on Kansas. It's through CRC Press. You can log online and just log my name, and you'll probably find the book. You can order it or order a used copy somewhere. If you're really interested in the entire study,